Hera Syndulla named her ship the Ghost. It was a technical description, not a metaphor. The rebellion probably filed it under pilot confidence. They should have filed it under fleet doctrine. Here is what the Ghost actually was, on paper. A VCX-100 light freighter, built by Corellian Engineering Corporation, priced at 155,000 credits new. A T-65B X-wing runs 150,000. The gap between them, 5,000 credits, is less than the cost of a used speeder bike. For those 5,000 extra credits, you get a ship with 2 main engines and 2 secondary engines, a Class 2 hyperdrive with a backup Class 14, a dorsal laser cannon turret, a forward chin turret, proton torpedo launchers, stealth systems extensive enough that the ship got named after its ability to vanish on Imperial sensors, and room for 6 passengers, and a docking slot. That's where the math stops being interesting and starts being extraordinary. The Phantom, the Ghost's VCX-series auxiliary starfighter, fits into a slot above the rear engines. This wasn't a retrofit. The VCX-series auxiliary was described in its design documentation as purposefully designed to function as a detachable module. Design intent, not accident. When docked tail forward, the Phantom performed triple duty: shuttle, fighter, and the Ghost's aft gun emplacement, its own laser cannons covering the rear arc. That's one attached craft. Now look at the sides. The Ghost was fitted with standardized port and starboard docking rings, the kind compatible with most ships in the galaxy. 2 Y-wings can dock on those lateral airlocks simultaneously, 1 per side. The Fantasy Flight Games Miniatures product description confirms it explicitly. The 3 smaller ships can securely dock with the Ghost, with the Y-wings attached to its right and left airlocks, and Phantom shuttle above its engines. One 155,000 credit light freighter, simultaneously carrying a Phantom attack shuttle aft and 2 BTL Y-wing fighters on port and starboard. 3 separate combat craft. 1 crew. 1 purchase price. A fleet in miniature. One community discussion about the ship put the logic plainly. Every ship this size should have an auxiliary starfighter attached to it. That viewer was reverse engineering a doctrine CEC had already built into the hull. So why didn't the rebellion build an entire fleet of these? Before answering that, the tactical case needs to be fully established, because the strategic argument only holds if the platform itself was genuinely extraordinary, not just interesting. There's a framework from the fan community that breaks the Ghost's combat profile into 3 criteria: too tough for a single TIE fighter, too maneuverable for a Star Destroyer's turbo lasers, enough firepower to engage a picket ship solo. Those aren't compliments. They're a checklist for what a guerrilla Navy platform must do to survive. Survivability first. The Ghost's sensor evasion came from 87 confirmed illegal upgrades to its stealth and sensor jamming systems, enough to make the freighter disappear from Imperial sensors entirely. The ship's name wasn't Hera's ego talking. It was a technical description. Against a TIE/LN with no shields, relying entirely on numbers and targeting data, a ship that disappears from the scope changes the engagement completely. The Spectres proved it operationally over years of missions against Imperial forces, surviving contact that would have destroyed a less capable vessel. The turbolaser argument is even better sourced. At Scarif, when Admiral Radis's task force engaged the Imperial blockade, an Imperial officer relayed, "We count 30 rebel ships, Lord Vader, but they are so small they're evading our turbolasers." That line, canonical film dialogue, is the clearest confirmation in the entire saga that ships of the Ghost's exact size class were specifically too small and too fast for Star Destroyer fire control to track effectively. The firepower case is direct. The Ghost carried a dorsal laser turret, a forward chin turret, and proton torpedoes, armament that let it engage Imperial ships in Rebels repeatedly and survive. Add the 3-point simultaneously deployable fighter wing, and what you have is a platform that punches hard above its 43-meter frame. On Corellia, Before Han Solo ever touched the Falcon, Lando Calrissian heard VCX-100 and replied, "That is a quality ship." He wasn't being generous. Which brings up the comparison everyone is already running. Yes, the Falcon is also a Corellian Engineering Corporation freighter. The YT-1300 is a different platform entirely. No purpose-built military docking architecture, no carrier function, no auxiliary starfighter slot designed into the hull. The Falcon is a legend built around one pilot's modifications. The Ghost is a doctrine designed into the hull from the factory. Different conversation. Back to the most underappreciated part of the Ghost's profile, and the argument that connects it most directly to the rebellion's strategic situation. Crew. The Ghost ran with a recommended complement of 4: pilot, co-pilot/engineer, and 2 gunners. The Spectres operated with 6, including non-combat personnel. The canonical minimum, per Wikipedia, is 1 pilot. A CR-90 Corvette requires between 46 and 165 crew. A Nebulon B frigate runs on 854, with a skeleton crew floor of 307. 307 people is the minimum to keep a Nebulon B operational. That same headcount, distributed across 6-person Ghost crews, would staff 51 independent multi-role carrier platforms. Every canonical account of the early rebellion describes a movement assembled from scattered cells, individually owned ships, and personnel who were never properly organized into anything resembling an integrated military. An insurgency that can't reliably staff capital ships doesn't get to compare them against pocket carriers on firepower. It compares them on how many people they consume per unit of combat output. On that metric, the Ghost wins every time. So why didn't the rebellion build an entire fleet of these? 3 structural realities explain it, and none of them require anyone to have been incompetent. First, the supply wasn't there. The VCX-100 came from CEC shipyards in orbit around Corellia. Solo, a Star Wars story, depicts Corellia as a world where the Empire maintained significant shipyard capacity for Star Destroyer construction. An Imperial-controlled planet with Imperial oversight in place. The precise commercial relationship between CEC and the Empire is murky in canon, but the geographic and political reality isn't. Corellia wasn't neutral ground. Any rebel attempt to order VCX-100s at scale would have required covert acquisition through intermediaries in sufficient volume to matter, outright theft and capture, or an open commercial relationship with a shipyard on an Imperial world that would have instantly compromised Alliance operational security. CEC built ships for individual buyers and free traders, not navies placing bulk military orders. The VCX-100 was never designed to be purchased by the case, and the rebellion had no mechanism to change that. Their documented acquisition method was stealing, salvaging, and converting, specifically because they couldn't manufacture at scale. That caps the supply ceiling before doctrine even enters the conversation. Second, the doctrine they'd already built didn't need it. This is the less obvious problem, and it's the more interesting one. Wikipedia's BTL Y-wing entry states directly that the Rebel Alliance sought to buy or steal as many Y-wings as they could to form their nascent rebellion. X-wings arrived through an even more specific pathway. Defecting Incom Corporation engineers brought the T-65 design to the Alliance directly. Neither acquisition route ran through a Corellian civilian manufacturer. The Y-wings were Clone Wars military surplus. The X-wings were a defection. The Alliance built its doctrine around what it could actually get, and what it got were hyperdrive-independent snubfighters that could operate without any carrier support at all. That was the specific advantage they prized over the Empire's TIE fighters. X-wings could jump into a system, execute a raid, and leave without needing a carrier to ferry them in. The Ghost's value proposition runs in exactly the opposite direction. It's a mobile command and operations base that deploys fighters. The rebellion had specifically designed its doctrine around not needing platforms like that. The Alliance didn't choose X-wings over Ghosts because X-wings were superior on first principles. They got X-wings because the procurement pathway existed, and then built a doctrine around the assets in hand. The preference for snub fighters wasn't stated Alliance policy. It was the accumulated weight of every acquisition that worked. By the time the Ghost was proving its value with the Spectres, the institutional logic of snub fighter doctrine was already load-bearing. Third, the organizational structure made standardization nearly impossible. Early in the Galactic Civil War, according to canonical sources, all ships in service of the Rebel Alliance were owned and operated by individual Alliance members, such as the Sulastans, Corellians, or Chandrillans, and these scattered units weren't properly organized. The Ghost itself is the perfect illustration. It was Hera Syndulla's personal ship years before the larger alliance formed around the Spectres. The rebellion assembled itself around what its members brought to the table. Standardizing a platform class requires centralized procurement. Centralized procurement requires centralized command. The early alliance deliberately lacked both, partly from resource constraints, partly as an operational security choice, because the same cell structure that prevented the Empire from decapitating the rebellion in one strike also prevented Alliance leadership from issuing a coordinated fleet-wide purchase order. There's a harder version of this argument too. The Ghost's combat record wasn't purely a function of the hull. Over 87 illegal upgrades reflected Hera Syndulla's specific operational requirements and years of modification. A factory stock VCX-100 is a capable ship. A Ghost equivalent requires Hera's modifications, and the specific judgment of a pilot willing to jump to hyperspace without pre-charted coordinates rather than be caught. Mass production doesn't replicate any of that. Those three constraints, supply, doctrine, organization, are why the rebellion never standardized the Ghost. Not incompetence, structural reality, which makes Scarif the most painful place in the entire saga to run the counterfactual. On the day the Profundity Task Force jumped into the Scarif system, Admiral Raddus commanded roughly 30 ships and approximately 66 deployed fighters. His flagship was the MC-75 starcruiser Profundity. His support consisted of 3 EF-76 Nebulon B escort frigates and several CR-90 corvettes. Blue Squadron, under General Merrick, flew cover. Jyn Erso's ground team went for the plans. The tactical problem at Scarif was the shield gate, the orbital installation that locked down the planetary shield and prevented the Death Star data from being transmitted to the fleet. The rebellion had to destroy it. The fleet's fighters were successfully evading Imperial turbo lasers, but evading fire isn't the same as breaking through a hardened installation with enough coordinated firepower to force a transmission window. The solution that worked was improvised under fire. A Hammerhead corvette used as a ram, pushing a disabled Star Destroyer into a second one until the shield gate failed. The plans escaped. Raddus didn't. Blue Squadron didn't. None of Jyn's team did. Now add 12 Ghost-class platforms to that battle. 12 ships jump in with the Profundity Task Force, each carrying a Phantom attack shuttle and 2 docked Y-wings on port and starboard airlocks. That's 24 additional fighters arriving pre-briefed and coordinated with their own mobile sensor and command platforms, roughly a 36% increase in deployed fighter count, plus 12 independent jamming suites degrading Imperial targeting across the engagement zone. 12 platforms small enough that Imperial officers would be reporting them as Ghost contacts. Against the shield gate itself, 12 ships with the forward firepower to engage Imperial patrol vessels, each capable of deploying fighters for coordinated torpedo runs, running a sustained coordinated engagement against a single installation. The Hammerhead improvisation worked, but it was an improvisation. A coordinated multi-platform strike with carrier-deployed Y-wings running attack patterns doesn't require a corvette captain to sacrifice their ship. The ground team might still have gotten the plans out. Raddus might have survived to command at Endor. Might. The Death Star's arrival imposed a hard ceiling on every version of the scenario. No fleet composition was going to survive Vader's flagship and the planet-killing weapon it carried. That constraint is real and honest. But the rebellion stood over a blueprint for exactly the kind of distributed, crew-efficient, multi-role carrier platform that a resource-starved insurgency should have been fielding at scale. The structural realities of how they built their war, cells, surplus, defections, and stolen hardware, meant they never recognized it as doctrine. They recognized it as Hera Syndulla's ship. The Ghost flew at Scarif. It flew at Endor. It was still flying at Exegol 35 years later, the only known VCX-100 in the Resistance's final desperate fleet, still operational on the same hull that first proved the concept above Lothal in 5 BBY. One ship, one crew, one war. What it should have been was a template. Subscribe for more stories like this.